Part 3, welcome to the final part of this terrain series. This is where I'll be phoning it all in because I was secretly asked to work on a Star Wars project. This is going to be the two most difficult pieces in the set, the dead body pile and the weirwood heart tree. I'll be starting with the dead body piles. Bodies will consist of these cheap plastic knights I found online. I bought 2 bags, but I only ended up needing 1. The figures are much bigger than the Song of Ice and Fire miniatures, and are made of a Army Man-like soft plastic. I could have used equally as cheap 1/72 scale soldiers from a variety of manufacturers, but they would have been much smaller, and I didn't want my body piles to look like a bunch of kids. Also, these soldiers came with horses. Points for that. I take a handful of troops and dry fit them to the cardboard token to get an idea of how many figures I would need per token. The figures' bases had to be removed with wire cutters and my X-Acto knife. The figures that ride the horses have this, so I had to clip that off as well. Now using my Dremel, I grind down the figures back flat. This will help with the gluing and make the bodies look like they've sunken into the ground. I'm making sure to wear a dust mask because I really don't want to breathe this cheap plastic into my lungs. The horses also had to be sanded down. I switched up the sides of the figures I was sanding to make the bodies more varied in the pile. Next, I had to cut up the figures in order to change their poses. I also clipped off weapons and shields. From here, I just sort of eyeball everything and arrange the pieces the best I could before gluing them down with hot glue. If there was an area with a large gap or a piece I couldn't fit, I would try to cover it with something like a shield or another body. I continue this process until the token is covered. Clipped weapons can be used to fill in open spots, and the more overlap, the more dynamic the piece will look when it is complete. A big visual influence for this terrain piece was the Netflix movie The King. The final battle at the end features heavily armored knights fighting in a giant mud patch. Everyone's getting knocked around, and it captures the brutality of what it would be like to fight in a battle like this. It's a pretty cool movie, check it out. Or just watch the end. That's kind of what I did. Just don't tell Timothée Chalamet. Now it was time for the dollar store spackle to fill in any gaps on the figures and to build up the edges to make them look like they were smooshed into the mud. Once the spackle dried, it was time to make everything really muddy. I'm using my regular basing mix, only with more dirt than usual, to get a thicker consistency this time. Then I spread it out with my brush. This is what it looked like when it was dry. I then spray painted it brown. The cardboard token for the heart tree is easily the most disappointing of the bunch. Even the one from the plastic set I wasn't a huge fan of. Looking back at scenes from the show and concept art, I decided to go with a stout tree with a large face. Kind of like that from older video games. I trace out a base onto EVA foam, then carefully split it to make the foam thinner. I also left this opening for where I will be placing the tree. The foam was glued down and the sides were sanded. I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to build the tree out of until I saw this shot from the show. The base of the tree has these cracks and holes like you would see in dried out driftwood. I decided I'd be able to get something similar to that if I used EVA foam since it has a similar surface. Using very exact measurements, I draw out a shape for the bottom of the tree and continue to cut out additional layers and hot glue them together. Building up the tree, I leave an opening to create a cavity for the face that I will be sculpting out of clay. For the next step, I use my Dremel to sand the edges of the tree and to blend the layers of the tree together. I'm using my Dremel on its slowest setting and taking my time to sculpt the tree shape. I'm also making sure to wear a dust mask so I don't breathe any of this foam particle. When I finished, I thought the back of the tree was still kind of flat, so I added 2 more pieces of foam to change up the space. Next, using some offcuts of foam, I used scissors and trimmed them down to create branches for the tree and glue them down. With all the branches in place, it was time to carve the face. I'm using my leftover keto clay from the brick walls when I should really be using Sculpey. I measure out the clay by placing it in the cavity of the tree. With the clay mixed together, I used an X-Acto knife to carve out the rough shape of the face. I then use a needle tool for the smaller details. This clay is very plasticky and it's like trying to carve a marshmallow. After turning my camera off and a lot of swearing, I ended up with this. The face was tossed into the oven, and once it was hardened, it was hot glued into the tree. The next step was to cover the entire tree in spackle. I also used spackle to make these raised root areas coming out of the tree. Really taking my time with the basing made these roots stand out even more. Once the glue was dry, I spray painted it brown, bringing us to the next step of painting. Just like everything from the set, I painted the base with a dry brushing of Morphang Brown, then Talaran Sand, and touched up the exposed rocks with Administarum Grey. I painted the knights in a color palette similar to the Starks and Lannisters, then stained everything with Agrax Earthshade. The heart tree was painted with a heavy body white acrylic paint, and I left areas where the brown spray paint could still be seen. I then watered down some black acrylic paint and used it as a wash on the whole tree. The black wash pooled in the recesses of the tree and gave me that dried wood look I was going for. I found a red peat moss that I'll be using to create the leaves of the heart tree. Like I did with the hedges, I hot glued the moss to the branches and continually build it up. Once I was happy with the shape, I trimmed the moss with scissors to blend the shapes together. Finally, I used some static grass and some army painter tufts, and these pieces were complete. I love the way these came out, and I don't mind the scale difference in the dead body pile, since it helps the pieces stand out amongst the troops. Now I have all my receipts in front of me, and I can tell you that I spent a total of $60.76. Saving $13.24, I was able to build everything in the plastic terrain set. 1 set of trees, 3 hedges, 3 palisades, 3 spike fences, 2 ruined and 1 low stone walls, 1 bog, 1 weirwood tree, and 4 dead body piles, as well as 2 plateaus. Wait a minute. Plateaus? Oh, son of a bitch.